Sometimes things are not as they first appear to be. Even miracles. Have you noticed that? I read about an altar boy who was cleaning out the pews in his church. And since many of you have been Baptist all your life, let me explain something to you about the Catholic Church you're probably at least vaguely familiar with. But they have a baptismal font. Now, it's not like our baptistry. We'd call it a fancy bowl. And it has water in it, holy water. Sometimes I have one in the front and in the back. This particular one was near the back of the church. And as the altar boy was cleaning out the pews, he noticed a man on crutches with a great deal of difficulty getting up the steps and made his way into the church. And he got to that font of holy water, and he sprinkled it on his legs. And then he just threw his crutches away. So the little boy ran and told the priest everything that had happened, and the priest says, "Oh, my boy, it's a miracle. Where is he now?" And he said, "Well, he's laying flat on his back next to the holy water." In this particular miracle, it appears that Jesus failed, at least partially, in his initial attempt to heal this blind man. He had to touch him, or did touch him, twice. So I call this the two-touch miracle. It is the only miracle that I'm aware of that came in two phases. Now, I don't know about you, but when I see something like that, instead of being plagued with doubt, I begin to ask, what is the message here? You see, this is so unique and so different. I'm absolutely convinced that the two touches are the message and where we really need to focus. But what is the message? Well, let's begin at the beginning and just look at this miracle step by step, person by person. First of all, notice the half-blind men leading the blind man. Now, maybe you don't see half-blind men, but I do. And I hope that I can point it out to you. But first, let me tell you something that many of you have heard before. I want to relate to you, share with you my own testimony and my own calling into the ministry. I grew up in a little Methodist church, and we were having a revival meeting, and I guess I was probably somewhere around 10 or 11, 12 years old. I don't remember exactly. But I do remember that during the course of that revival, I was under real conviction, and I wanted to be saved. And I went forward not once during that week, but twice. I left there lost. Now, I don't know if we were taught it or if it was just my mixed up mind, but in that church we had a mourner's bench. Any of you ever seen a mourner's bench? I don't like them, and I'll tell you why. I had the impression that the way to be saved was to come to the mourner's bench and do what? Mourn. And I thought that I had to beg and plead with God to save me. I want to tell you this morning, I like to see tears in people's eyes when they repent, but it's not the tears, it's trusting in Jesus Christ. And we don't have to mourn, we don't have to beg, we don't have to plead with Jesus Christ. He waits to receive us. I went through my teenage years, and I was, to put it mildly, a mess. Then one night after Kathy and I married on a Saturday night, I was lying in bed, and I told them this morning, it's the only way I know how to put it, God yelled at me. Now, there was no audible voice at all, but it could have been this loud and it wouldn't have been any clearer. He said to me, again, no audible voice, you're either going to be saved or you're going to die. Which shall it be? You know, hindsight's 20/20, isn't it? I was heavily involved in alcohol and beginning to really enjoy drugs. And I'm convinced that if I had continued down that road just a little bit longer, there wouldn't have been any return. But Sunday morning rolled around, and I was about the third or fourth seat from the back at Calvary Baptist Church in Smithville, Tennessee. The invitation was given, and when I finally stepped out, I tore out. You know what that means, right? Man, I ripped down that aisle. Kenneth Trammell opened the Bible with me to Romans chapter 10. And for the first time in my life, I understood. A church boy, but for the first time in my life, I understood that salvation is based on the finished work of Jesus Christ and putting my faith and trust in Him. Well, I was about 8 or 9, I think, somewhere along in there. I didn't write it down, so I don't remember. But I began to be really impressed. Didn't know how to state it, but I really felt like God was going to call me to preach. And I told my mama, Mama, when I grow up, I'm going to be a preacher. Some of you know what she told me. She looked at me with a pitiful smile and said, Son, you'll never make any money that way. That's a mama's heart, right? Well, things have changed and been blessed even financially more than I ever imagined. But anyway, there I was, a rebellious teenager in a lot of trouble, saved in adulthood. And you know, when I was saved, I never thought a thing about preaching for a number of years. Ironically, in those teenage years when I was so rebellious, sometimes I would get under conviction and I would think, well, now if I'm saved, I'm going to have to preach, and I sure don't want to preach. I had shared this with my sister that recently died a number of years ago, and I said, you know, what puzzles me is I don't believe that God speaks to a lost person. And she was a wise old girl, spiritually wise. She really was. She said something that I've thought about a lot since then. She said, you know, what makes you think that God could not speak to you as an innocent child? You see, an innocent child's not lost. Have you ever thought of that? And probably in my mind, it was the devil telling me in those rebellious teenage years, if you're saved, you're going to have to preach, because that was a problem for me. Now, that's my story. And I'm sticking to it, as they say. Now, I asked Jason this morning, ask any of you, did you feel like God was calling you into the ministry before you were saved? How many of you made 3 trips down the aisle of a church before you were saved? 1. What if then, my experience, I felt God calling me to preach when I was just a child, and I said, well, if you're really called to preach, it has to be by the time you're 9 years old. Or, if you're really saved, it takes 3 trips down the aisles of a church. Did you know it really doesn't take any trips down the aisle of a church? You see, we can have these preconceived ideas about how God has to do something, and it gets in His way. And He can't do what He wants to do. Now, where am I going with this? Well, look at what this passage says. They came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored Him to touch Him. They are unnamed. Do you see that word, they? They did the right thing. They brought Him to Jesus. But they had a preconceived idea. Apparently, did you notice that? They begged Jesus to do what? Touch Him. Most likely, they had seen Jesus touch blind people before and restore their sight. So they just assumed that to heal him, He had to touch him. So they didn't bring him and say, Jesus, heal him. They begged Him, Jesus, touch him. Did Jesus have to touch him? Of course not. There were times that he performed miracles and he never even saw the person. You may think this isn't very common, but in the Old Testament, there's this fellow by the name of Naaman. You remember him? Naaman had a problem. What kind of problem was it? He had leprosy and happened to have a little Jewish girl in his household, and she said to one of the women, "Oh, if he could just go to old Elijah, man of God, he'd take care of that leprosy." The word got to Naaman. Naaman took off. He ended up at Elijah's door. You remember that? And here he was, a dignitary with an envoy and all of this wealth. And he arrived at his house, and he had the audacity to not even come out. Remember that? Soon the master said, "Go tell him to dunk in the Jordan River 7 times. Naaman was irate, wasn't he? But what we often overlook is this, 2 Kings 5:11. Now Naaman was furious, and he went away and said, "Behold, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leprosy." Naaman knew how God was going to have to do it. Come out and say, "Allah peanut butter sandwiches," right? Yeah, that's the new phrase now. And he was going to go home. He was having a hissy fit. You know what a hissy fit is? One of his servants said, "Now, wait a minute, Naaman. If he told you to go do something that was difficult, wouldn't you do it?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I'd do that." "Well, go dunk." Now, I've asked you this before in the past. If he went off mad and didn't go dunk, what would have happened? Still has leprosy. Don't think that we don't have these preconceived ideas of how God must do something. And because of our preconceived idea and putting God in the box, we prevent him from working. God's God. He can do things the way he wants to, right? Somebody said that if these miracles had been today, there was one time when he just healed the blind, touched him and healed him. This time he used spittle. On another occasion, he made a mud cake. You remember this? And he put it on a man's eyes, and he says, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." Well, somebody said if that had been today, we'd have the spit, the no spit, and the muddy eye Baptist church. Yeah. Those things are important to understanding in the context, but that is not the major factor. They were half blind. Now look at the blind man. He was blind. Now think about the frequency of it, especially in those days. I have an old commentary, and I don't know when it was published. I wished I had, but it's a reprint. But I can tell it must be from somewhere around the mid-1800s because of the lack of medical technology. But here is what I gleaned from that particular commentary. It said 1/10 of the population of Joppa suffers from ophthalma. Now that's a word we don't use anymore, but it's an inflammation of the eyes that leaves you virtually blind. It's caused from flies and different types of infections. Then he goes on to say in Cairo, out of 250,000 people, there are 4,000 that are blind. Before I had LASIK surgery, my vision was 2,400. I could be up here preaching without my glasses. You could sneak out, and I wouldn't have known it. I never did let you know that either, did I? But there are no corrective lens. How many people would have been running around and could only half see, or if they were blind, a simple eye infection, nothing could be done. Now think about the horrors of it. And this man was one of the fortunate ones. He really was. They, whoever they were, brought him to Jesus. Apparently they had been taking care of him. No social services in that day. If you were blind and no one took care of you, what would happen to you? You'd die. You couldn't last long. So he had people caring for him, but at its best, blindness is bad. I've always thought I'd really hate to lose my mind even more than I have. But the second thing that would scare me most would be losing my eyesight. Now, my sister doesn't sit around and have a pity party, the one that went blind virtually overnight, and total blindness, nothing. But she will tell you, and she's a Christian woman, that when that disease took her eyesight, she wished it had taken her life. She's having a horrible time adjusting to the darkness. That's a sad situation, isn't it? Now, I want to let you in on a little something and allude to later. This is real, but there's no doubt in my mind that this is also used as something of a parable of the spiritual blindness of people. Because now look at this half-blind man in 23 and 24. He looked at him, he said, now do you see anything? After he put the spittle on his eyes. He said, well, I see men like trees walking. Notice exactly what he did. First of all, Jesus led him out of the city. You know what he's doing? Getting him out of the peering eyes of the crowd. Then he uses, the King James calls it spittle, we call it spit. He put it on his eyes. Now, there are those that say, and this may be part of it, that he was cleaning the eyes off. They were not as concerned about hygiene in that day, and it wouldn't have been very uncommon for a person that was blind to had flies around their eyes, and they would be dirty and soiled and all matted up, and that he was cleaning them off in preparation for him seeing. But I think there's something else here much more profound. They believed in the curative power of salah.